The discovery came by accident. In the summer of 2007, deep in the forests of western Oregon, a logger paused when his chainsaw bit against something hard beneath the roots of a fallen fir. He expected a stone. Instead, his blade scraped against rusting metal. Kneeling in the damp earth, he uncovered a small box, pitted with age, sealed tight with old tape and a rusted latch. When he pried it open, the smell hit him first, metallic, sour, like wet coins mixed with rot. Inside were 2 baseball caps with faded Boy Scouts patches, wrapped in yellowed plastic. Beneath them lay small sneakers, stiff with time, one heel still carrying a trace of mud hardened like plaster. In the right shoe, something rattled. He turned it over and froze, a sliver of bone, pale, fragile, unmistakably human. The man slammed the lid shut, hands trembling, and staggered back from the hole. For years, locals had whispered about the boys who never came back. He had laughed it off, the way people do with old tragedies that seem too distant to matter. But now the past was in his hands, undeniable, as real as the hum of the saw still idling behind him. News traveled quickly. The sheriff's office cordoned off the area. Reporters swarmed, and by nightfall the headlines screamed of new evidence in one of Oregon's darkest mysteries. Everyone in town knew what it meant. The children. The 7 who had walked into the woods 15 years earlier and vanished. To understand the weight of that box, you have to go back to 1992. It was a hot July afternoon in a small town that barely registered on most maps. The Boy Scouts troop had been planning their summer outing for weeks. A short hike, a night of camping, the kind of tradition that was supposed to be as safe as church. Parents dropped their sons off at the community center parking lot, hugged them goodbye, reminded them about bug spray and sunscreen. The boys wore matching caps, laughed too loud, shoved each other with the restless energy of 12-year-olds. One mother lingered longer than the rest. She kissed her son's forehead twice, as if she knew she wouldn't get another chance. Another father, trying to hide his nerves, shouted after the group, "Don't get lost out there! Hear me?" Everyone laughed. No one imagined the words would echo for years. The troop set off down the trail, their voices rising above the hum of insects and the creak of trees in the heat. For the first few hours, it was exactly what it should have been. Boys skipping rocks across the river, a counselor reminding them to stick together, the promise of marshmallows later that night. But as the afternoon wore on, the air thickened. Clouds pressed in, a summer storm swelling earlier than expected. Somewhere near the old logging road, the group scattered briefly, some to relieve themselves, others to chase after a squirrel or a sound in the underbrush. The counselor called them back, counted quickly, and assumed all were accounted for. By the time they regrouped at camp, 7 boys were missing. At first, there was no panic. Kids wandered off all the time, and the woods were familiar. "They'll be back any minute," the counselor assured the parents when evening fell. But the sun sank behind the hills, shadows stretched long, and the boys never returned. The search began before midnight. Flashlights swept through the trees, names were shouted into the storm, radios crackled with updates that meant nothing. Volunteers combed the trails at dawn, leaving food at intersections in case the boys stumbled back. But the paths revealed only silence. By the second day, law enforcement expanded the perimeter. Helicopters traced the ridgelines, dogs sniffed through undergrowth, but the ground gave up nothing. No tracks, no clothing, not even a candy wrapper. It was as though the forest had swallowed them whole. The counselor swore he'd seen them only minutes before they were missed. One of the boys' mothers clutched his shirt front and screamed, "You let them go!" while deputies pulled her away. reporters filed stories about vanishing into thin air, feeding the sense that what had happened wasn't just tragic, but impossible. And yet, the last glimpse anyone had of the 7 children was ordinary. They were laughing. They were walking down a trail worn smooth by decades of boots. They were safe. Until they weren't. The official record ended with an empty clearing, a trail that carried no footprints past a certain bend, and a silence that seemed to grow heavier the longer you stood in it. 15 years later, the box unearthed beneath the tree roots told a story no one wanted to believe. Because if those sneakers, if that bone, had been hidden there all this time, then the boys hadn't wandered off into the wilderness at all. Someone had brought them here. Someone had buried them close enough that the forest itself had been keeping their secret. And yet, for all the answers the box seemed to promise, it raised only one terrifying question. If this was where the trail ended, why had no one ever found it before? Just wondering, where are you watching from? Write it down, Bello. The discovery of the box in 2007 reignited the nightmare. But to understand the weight of it, you have to return to those first frantic weeks in 1992 when the boys first went missing and the town still believed they would come home. By sunrise after that storm, the search was already massive. Police cruisers lined the edge of the forest, their lights flashing against the wet bark of the trees. Parents stood in small clusters, arms crossed tight against their chests, watching as deputies, firefighters, and volunteers fanned out with maps and radios. By noon, the National Guard was on site. A helicopter droned overhead, the sound bouncing between the hills. For a town of barely 6,000 people, it felt as though the whole world had turned its eyes on them. Every trailhead was checked, every logging road blocked. Scent dogs were brought in from Portland. At first, hope was tangible. Searchers believed they were minutes away from finding the boys huddled under a fallen log or trudging back hungry and tired. But as the hours stretched, that optimism began to crack. One mother refused to leave the staging area. She swore she heard her son's voice calling faintly from the woods, a high, thin sound like a child shouting, "Mom!" Searchers froze, listened, then ran toward the trees. The dogs picked up a trail for nearly a mile, pulling handlers with them, until the scent died abruptly at the edge of the river. The animals circled, confused, whining at the water. It was as if the boys had stepped into the current and disappeared without leaving so much as a ripple. On the third day, a deputy brought out something found near the creek, a small jacket, bright red, neatly folded and placed atop a stone. The jacket was bone dry despite 2 nights of rain. It belonged to one of the missing boys. His parents collapsed when they saw it. Investigators argued over what it meant. Had he taken it off himself? Or had someone staged it there? The way it was folded seemed deliberate, unsettling. The town spiraled into fear. Rumors spread faster than official statements. Some claimed a white van had been seen circling near the campgrounds. Others whispered about an ex-convict living in a shack outside town, a man already feared for his temper. Deputies questioned him, but his alibi, working overnight at a mill, checked out. Still, suspicion lingered. More disturbing were the whispers among the children left behind. They began trading stories about the box in the woods, a shadowy figure who took kids who stayed out after dark. Adults dismissed it as hysteria, but the words stuck. The image of a box waiting somewhere in the forest, swallowing children, crawled under everyone's skin. By the end of the first week, hundreds had searched. Planes traced grid patterns above. Divers scoured the deeper pools of the river. Nothing. Not a footprint. Not a candy wrapper. not the scrape of a boot against a rock. 7 boys gone, as if the trees themselves had closed around them and erased their existence. Exhaustion began to wear on the searchers. Tempers flared at community meetings. Some accused law enforcement of bungling the search. Others turned on neighbors, convinced someone among them had answers. A group of angry fathers nearly stormed the sheriff's office demanding arrests, but there was no one to arrest. The most haunting image came when news cameras were finally allowed into the campsite. Reporters filmed rows of empty sleeping bags inside canvas tents, still zipped open from when the boys had left them hours earlier. Flashlights lay on the ground, one still faintly glowing. A deck of playing cards sat scattered in the dirt, as if the game had been abandoned mid-hand. There was no sign of struggle, only absence. On the 12th day, the sheriff announced the official search would be scaled back. Helicopters were too costly to keep in the air, and volunteers were burning out. Families screamed in protest. One mother lunged at the microphone, crying, "Don't you dare quit on them! They didn't just walk away. Someone has them." Her words echoed across the gymnasium where the briefing was held. The cameras caught every second, and the footage ran on national news. But within weeks, the search was no longer headline news. Reporters packed up. Deputies returned to routine patrols. The forest grew quiet again. And yet, for those left behind, the silence was unbearable. Parents slept in shifts, hoping for a knock at the door. Some left porch lights burning every night, small beacons against the endless dark. The case file thickened with false leads and dead ends, but the truth was buried deeper than anyone realized. Because, while the official searches faded, the woods still held their secrets. And even then, small details kept surfacing. Details that didn't fit any explanation law enforcement offered. Months passed after the official search ended. The woods grew back into themselves. Trails once trampled by volunteers closed over with moss and ferns. The river, swollen from spring melt, carried no answers downstream. By winter of '92, the case had become an open wound in the town. Parents clung to rituals, driving past the empty campsite, leaving flowers at the trailhead, keeping birthday cakes uncut. Some families moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders. Others stayed, stubbornly, as though presence alone could will the boys back. Sheriff's deputies spoke carefully to the press. Their words shifted. Ongoing investigation. Active tips. No confirmed evidence. Behind closed doors, they admitted what everyone feared. There was nothing more to chase. But then, in early 1993, a small discovery forced everything open again. 2 forestry workers were clearing brush near an old fire road several miles outside the official search grid. One spotted something glinting beneath wet leaves. He bent down and lifted a compass. Brass, heavy, its glass face cracked but intact. On the back was an engraving, initials and a troop number. It matched perfectly to one of the missing boys. The compass had no business being there. That stretch of forest had been searched, and it lay far beyond where investigators believed the children could have wandered on their own. Yet here it was, weathered but unmistakably theirs. When the sheriff's office delivered the object to the family, the reaction was visceral. The boy's father held it in his palm and whispered, "He never went anywhere without it." His mother, shaking, said only, "If the compass is here, then where is my son?" Instead of hope, the find fueled despair. Parents argued with detectives. Had the boys walked further than assumed? Or had someone carried their belongings into the woods, planting them like breadcrumbs years later? Around the same time, a local trapper came forward with his own story. He had kept silent during the chaos of the initial search. But now, months later, his conscience gnawed at him. The night the boys vanished, he swore he heard an engine deep in the forest. A steady drone, mechanical, not the rumble of thunder. It was strange, he explained, because no road cut through that section of timber. He remembered the sound moving slowly, then stopping. Afterward, only silence. Reporters seized on the claim. If true, it suggested transport. Someone had been inside the forest that night with machinery, maybe a vehicle on a logging trail long abandoned. But why would they be there? And what connection did it have to the vanished boys? Theories multiplied. Some said the children had been taken out of the area entirely. Others speculated about hunting cabins hidden off-grid, places where no search teams had ventured. Each rumor twisted the knife deeper into parents, already drowning in grief. Then came the letter. It arrived at the office of the local newspaper, tucked in a plain envelope with no return address. The postmark blurred, impossible to trace. The message inside was short, typed in block letters. You are looking in the wrong place. No explanation, no signature, just those 6 words. The editor turned it over to law enforcement, who dismissed it as a cruel prank. But the timing, so soon after the compass appeared, was impossible to ignore. Some parents clung to it as proof. Someone knew more. Someone was taunting them. Privately, detectives argued. One group insisted the items were genuine evidence, signaling foul play. Another suspected manipulation, that whoever was responsible was deliberately feeding scraps to keep families desperate and investigators confused. Either way, the case shifted from tragedy to something more sinister. Small-town life began to corrode under the weight of suspicion. Neighbors eyed each other differently. At diners and church gatherings, conversations stopped when certain names came up. Kids who'd once worn their scout uniforms proudly now hid them in closets. Trust cracked in ways that never fully healed. The compass was logged, photographed, and bagged in evidence. The letter joined it. Both sat in a cabinet in the sheriff's office, inert objects that carried unbearable weight. Families demanded answers, but investigators had none. What haunted people most was not just the loss, but the precision of the silence. No ransom notes, no confirmed sightings, no bodies, just a compass, a whisper of an engine, and a warning typed by unseen hands. And as the seasons turned, the town realized the disappearance of 7 boys was no longer simply an unsolved case. It was becoming a legend, something spoken about in low voices, a story that both parents and children carried like a scar. But legends have roots, and in this one, buried under years of moss and mud, fragments still waited, ready to surface when least expected. If this story touched you, even a little, let me know in the comments. We read them all. Years passed. The official line was that the case had gone cold. Files gathered dust in the sheriff's office. Boxes pushed to the back of evidence rooms. In the town itself, silence hardened into routine. Children grew up with an unspoken warning in their homes. Don't wander too far. Don't trust strangers. Don't bring up the scouts. But absence has a way of speaking, and sometimes it screamed. One mother, Linda Chavez, whose son Daniel was among the missing, kept her landline phone beside her bed, even after the rest of the world had switched to cordless models. She said she couldn't sleep unless it was close. One night, nearly 5 years after the disappearance, the phone rang at 2:11 a.m. She answered, heart already racing. On the line was a man's voice, low, deliberate, whispering 4 words. He's still here. Then, silence. A click. She stayed frozen, the receiver pressed to her ear, hearing the deadline hum. The words echoed, looping, until she finally dropped the phone on the floor. Police traced what they could. The call had bounced through multiple exchanges. It was impossible to pinpoint. To Linda, that was worse than if it had been a cruel prank, because it meant someone knew how to make sure they couldn't be found. Her face the next morning, pale and trembling, was seared into the memory of the detective who took her report. He later admitted privately, "I don't think she was lying. I think someone wanted her to know." Soon after, another fragment surfaced. A hunter, tracking deer in the thick forest that bordered the original search zone, noticed something odd beneath a tangle of roots, a small wooden disc, crudely carved, strung on rotting twine. It was a medallion bearing the Boy Scouts emblem. But it wasn't the emblem that chilled him. Scratched into the back were 3 jagged letters, DC, the initials of Daniel Chavez, the same boy whose mother had taken that call. Experts examined it. The cuts were rough, shallow, but consistent with a child's hand using a pocket knife. The wood was weathered, likely years old. To Daniel's parents, it wasn't coincidence. It was a message. Their son had been alive long enough to mark his name into something and leave it behind. The sheriff's department, wary of promising too much, filed it as inconclusive. But locals began to whisper. Some remembered a white van with no plates that had been parked near the town service road in the weeks before the boys vanished. It was seen by multiple neighbors, always at odd hours, headlights off. At the time, no one thought to connect it to the troop outing. Now, with the medallion in hand, those memories sharpened into accusations. "That van wasn't just passing through," one man insisted. "It was watching." Slowly, the town's story shifted. What had once been framed as a tragic accident in the wilderness began to look like something darker, organized, intentional, planned. People began to use words they hadn't dared before: trafficking, ring, cover-up. And then came the photo. It arrived at the county police station in a plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from a neighboring state. Inside was a single photograph, faded, grainy, slightly out of focus, but enough to make hearts stop. It showed a group of boys huddled together in what looked like a basement or warehouse. A bare bulb hung overhead, casting harsh shadows on concrete walls. Their faces were blurred by motion, but the outlines were there. The height, the haircuts, the same t-shirts they had been wearing on the day of the hike. Parents gathered around the image in the sheriff's office. One by one, they pointed trembling fingers. "That's my son's jacket. Look at his ears. That's him." There was no consensus among investigators. Some argued it was staged, another cruel prank meant to torment families. Others couldn't dismiss the parents' certainty. The details were too precise, the timing too cruel. For the families, though, it was like a pulse detected after years of flat line. Proof, or at least the possibility, that their children had survived long after the forest swallowed them. The sheriff, cornered by reporters, gave a stiff statement. "We cannot verify the authenticity of this image." But his eyes betrayed him. He looked like a man who had glimpsed something he wished he hadn't. And in the quiet that followed, another realization set in. If the photo was real, it meant someone had kept the boys alive. Someone had watched them. Someone had chosen when and how to show that sliver of evidence. The question was no longer just, where are they? It was who is holding the strings, and why are they still playing this game after all these years? The photograph sent shockwaves through the town, but instead of clarity, it deepened the fog. For parents, it was undeniable proof. For officials, it was an inconvenient anomaly that threatened to unravel the old narrative. And so, once again, people took matters into their own hands. A group of volunteers, some of them the same men who had combed the forest a decade earlier, returned to the woods, determined to search where the authorities had long stopped looking. They focused on the area near the ridge where the hunter had found the medallion. "If Daniel left a sign here," one of them said, "maybe the others left something too." The deeper they pushed into the undergrowth, the stranger the forest felt. Whole sections seemed unnaturally quiet, as if the usual chatter of birds had been smothered. The ground sloped unevenly, littered with fallen trunks and bramble, places no one had thought to search thoroughly in 1992 when time was slipping away and resources were stretched thin. By the third day, a pair of volunteers stumbled upon something that didn't fit the natural order. From a distance, it looked like a collapsed animal den, but up close the soil was disturbed, the roots hacked away in neat cuts. They dug with their hands until the tip of a rusted metal sheet emerged. Beneath it was an opening. It wasn't wide, just enough for a small body to crawl through. The air that rushed out smelled stale, metallic, with a faint chemical tang. They lowered a flashlight into the hole and froze. It wasn't a den. It was a bunker. Inside was a space no larger than a single-car garage, reinforced with planks and cinder blocks. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with dust-covered cans of food. Melted candles sat in pools of hardened wax. On the floor were scraps of fabric, worn thin from use, children's clothing, striped shirts, a torn sock with a Boy Scout logo. Most disturbing was the wall. Across it, written in blackened charcoal, were the words, "We are 7. No one hears us." The letters were uneven, childlike. Some trailed off as though the writer's hand had grown weak. News of the bunker spread fast. Parents were called in, their faces pale as they descended into the cramped darkness where they imagined their children trapped. One mother collapsed when she saw a shoe with frayed laces that she swore had belonged to her son. Another father gripped the wall where the message was scrawled, tracing the words with shaking fingers, as if by touch he could connect to the child who had written them. The sheriff's office secured the site, but the atmosphere was heavy with a truth no one wanted to voice. The boys hadn't just disappeared. They had been held here, in this underground room, hidden just beneath the roots of the forest. Forensic teams examined everything. The canned food bore expiration dates from the late 80s. The candles were standard hardware store types, common and untraceable. But small things mattered. A folded wrapper from a candy bar manufactured in 1991. A button from a scout uniform. A strip of duct tape with faint fingerprints too smudged to analyze. And then there was the scrap of paper. It was torn from a school notebook, edges ragged. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, as if written in fear. 2 words, nothing more. Don't trust. The note was passed carefully from hand to hand, each person studying it, each feeling a fresh wave of dread. Don't trust who? The adults leading the trip? The police? Each other? The bunker raised more questions than answers. If the boys had been alive here, how long had they been kept? Who had fed them? Why had no one heard their cries during those frantic early weeks when the forest was crawling with search teams? A retired forest ranger, brought in to consult, studied the structure. He shook his head. "This wasn't built by kids," he said firmly. "Whoever made this knew what they were doing. The support beams, the venting, it's crude, but it's intentional. Someone planned this." The implications spread through town like wildfire. These weren't random boys who wandered off. They had been taken, hidden, and kept. For some purpose no one wanted to imagine. Journalists swarmed the area, snapping photos of the bunker's entrance, pressing parents for comment. One local paper ran the headline, "The forest kept them alive." Another was blunter. The town looked away. For the families, it was torture all over again. Seeing the bunker made them relive the helplessness of those early days, but now it carried an unbearable new layer. The realization that their children may have survived for weeks, maybe longer, waiting in vain to be rescued. At night, the parents called one another, replaying every detail. One swore the handwriting on the wall belonged to his son, recalling the way he formed certain letters. Another insisted the note saying, "Don't trust," matched his boy's scrawl. Whether or not it was true didn't matter. The conviction in their voices was enough to make others believe. The sheriff tried to contain speculation. In a press briefing, he said, "We have evidence suggesting this location was used in connection with the disappearance. We cannot, at this time, draw conclusions about how long or by whom." His words were careful, clinical, but his eyes betrayed unease. Because if the bunker was real and the children had left signs behind, someone else must have known. Someone must have built it, stocked it, then abandoned it, and that someone had managed to stay hidden for over a decade. The families gathered one evening at the community hall, the same place where years earlier they had organized volunteer search grids. This time the mood was different. There were no maps on the walls, no lists of assignments. Only grief, anger, and a growing suspicion that the truth had always been closer than they wanted to admit. One father stood and asked the question aloud. If they were down there, and if that note says, "Don't trust," then who were we not supposed to trust? The men we sent into the woods with them? The deputies who told us to stop searching? Or each other? Silence followed, heavier than words. Outside the forest loomed, its dark canopy swaying in the night wind. The bunker had been a hidden room in its depths, a cruel reminder that the story wasn't finished. And somewhere, perhaps, more of those hidden rooms existed. The bunker should have been the turning point, but instead it opened an entirely new labyrinth. In the weeks that followed, journalists and amateur sleuths flooded the town, chasing every angle. Some called it a smoking gun, others dismissed it as a decoy. For the parents, it was worse than either. It was proof their sons had been alive longer than anyone admitted, and the knowledge gnawed at them every waking hour. Then the whispers began. One of the journalists, a Portland-based investigator named Claire Jensen, started digging into why the bunker hadn't been found during the original search in 1992. She filed records requests, pressed retired deputies for interviews, and combed through yellowed newspapers in the county library. What she uncovered was disturbing. During the first week of the search, a tip had been called in about noises near the abandoned sawmill at the edge of the forest. But the lead was never pursued. A former deputy, now living 3 counties away, finally agreed to meet her off the record. Over coffee in a dim diner, he confessed that they had wanted to search the sawmill. "We were told no," he said flatly. "The order came from above. Said it was federal land under some kind of lease. We were wasting time there." He leaned back in his booth, eyes darting to the door. "I didn't buy it then, and I don't buy it now." Claire pressed him. Who gave the order? He wouldn't say, or maybe he didn't know. Still, it was enough. She went to the courthouse archives and sifted through property records. What she found startled her. In 1989, 3 years before the boys vanished, the sawmill had been quietly sold to a shell corporation with a mailing address in Washington, D.C. No owners listed. No public record of activity. It had just sat there, officially abandoned, unofficially untouchable. When the families heard about this, outrage boiled over. They gathered again at the community hall, demanding answers. Mothers slammed their fists on tables, fathers shouted until their voices cracked. "You're telling me my boy could have been in there, "And they told you not to look?" one screamed at the sheriff, who could only stammer that he hadn't been in charge back then. The tension drew in national reporters. For a brief moment, the story was back on evening news. Did authorities ignore leads in Oregon Scout's disappearance? But just as quickly, coverage faded. A bigger scandal elsewhere drowned it out, and the town was left again with only rumors and grief. Still, the momentum didn't die. Claire and two colleagues pushed further, requesting federal files. Most came back stamped with black bars of redaction, useless. But one thin folder slipped through. An old FBI field report, dated July 1992. It referenced multiple civilian reports of children's voices near the Mackenzie Forest perimeter, close to Sawmill property line. In the margin, someone had scrawled a chilling note. Handled. No further action. When Claire showed the document to the families, the room erupted. One mother sobbed into her hands. A father shouted that it was proof of a cover-up. Another simply sat in silence, staring at the paper as though it might burn through his fingers. Meanwhile, another strange detail surfaced. A retired dispatcher admitted she'd logged several calls the night of the disappearance. People reporting bright floodlights moving in the forest after midnight. Those records, she said, were later lost from the official log. "We all knew something was off," she whispered, "but you didn't question it back then. You'd lose your job." The story shifted again from tragedy to something darker. Not only had the boys vanished, but the people entrusted to protect them had ignored leads, erased evidence, perhaps even helped conceal what really happened. The bickering in town grew ugly. Some accused the sheriff's office of incompetence. Others muttered about federal involvement. A few whispered that certain townsfolk must have known more than they admitted. Old friendships cracked. Neighbors stopped speaking. In a community this small, suspicion spread like wildfire. One evening, Claire visited the site of the sawmill herself. The buildings sagged under moss and rot, the smell of oil still faint in the soil. She walked through the hollow shell of the main hall and found herself staring at a thick iron door half buried in collapsed timber. It looked like an entrance to a basement, or maybe another bunker. But the door was welded shut, seams sealed with metal so thick it would take machinery to pry open. Someone had wanted it permanently closed. The discovery reignited the family's anger. They demanded the county bring in heavy equipment, open the door. But officials stalled, citing property rights, federal restrictions, endless paperwork. Weeks dragged on, excuses piled higher, and the door remained untouched. For the mothers and fathers, it was unbearable. They had lived 15 years without answers, and now, finally, there was a place that seemed to whisper their children's names. Yet no one in authority would listen. One night, a father who'd lost his youngest boy drove out there with a crowbar. He worked until his hands bled, sparks flying uselessly against the welds. In the morning, he was found asleep against the door, the crowbar bent, his face streaked with tears. The pressure cooker of grief, suspicion, and official silence was reaching a breaking point. And then came the most haunting revelation yet. In the archives of a regional newspaper, a junior reporter digging for background stumbled on a single line in an unpublished draft from 1992. It was written by a local stringer who'd been pulled off the case after just a week. The sentence read, "Residents claim to have seen a convoy of dark vans leaving the forest road the night of June 18th. The date was the exact night the scouts disappeared. Why was that detail buried? Who had silenced it? And more importantly, what or who was in those vans? The sawmill was a carcass of another era. Its tin roof sagged inward, eaten by rust and rain, while blackberry thorns curled through broken windows. Even in daylight, the place felt suffocating, like the air itself carried the weight of everything it had witnessed. It was Claire who insisted they go inside. She had been warned off a dozen times, by police, by county officials, even by her own editor, but she couldn't ignore the whispers that kept circling back to this place. This time, she wasn't alone. Two fathers and one mother of the missing scouts had agreed to come with her. For them, it wasn't curiosity anymore. It was the last thread. They pried the side door open with a crowbar. The hinges shrieked like an animal. Dust billowed out, sharp and metallic, mixed with the rot of oil-soaked wood. Every footstep inside echoed too loudly, as if the building were a hollow chest cavity. Near a pile of warped lumber, one of the fathers froze. He crouched, reached trembling fingers between the slats, and pulled something out. A small shoe. Mud-caked, its leather cracked, the laces long gone. He didn't need to check the size. His face collapsed before he even spoke. These were his. I bought them the spring before. His voice broke off. The shoe dangled from his hand, swaying like a pendulum. The others stood in silence. There was no room for words in that moment. They pressed on, pushing deeper into the main hall. A staircase sagged downward into the basement. The smell grew denser there, damp concrete, rust, a faint undercurrent of something sour that clung to the nose. The basement looked empty at first, just rows of mold-stained support beams. But on the far wall, half hidden by old tarps, was a patch of brick that didn't match the rest. Newer, cleaner, with mortar lines sharper than the decayed walls around it. Claire tapped it with the crowbar. Solid. It took them an hour to break through. Bricks fell one by one, clattering onto the floor. Behind the wall, a narrow passage. The air that leaked out was colder, stagnant, carrying the stale bitterness of something sealed away. They squeezed inside, flashlights slicing through blackness. The tunnel was claustrophobic, barely wide enough for two shoulders. Their beams of light picked out strange marks along the walls. Tiny grooves, scratches running downward in uneven lines. Claire leaned closer. They weren't tool marks. They were fingernail trails. One of the mothers pressed her hand against the wall, tracing the grooves. Her breath came in shallow bursts. "They were here," she whispered. The passage snaked downward, every step heavier, the silence pressing tighter. Then the tunnel widened abruptly into a small chamber no bigger than a living room. The concrete walls glistened faintly, water seeping through cracks. And on those walls, drawings. Primitive, childlike, scrawled in charcoal or ash. Stick figures in a line, hand in hand. 7 of them. But one figure was scratched out violently, rubbed until only a dark smear remained. The mother's knees buckled. She fell against the wall, sobbing into her sleeve. One of the fathers turned away, pounding his fist into the concrete until his knuckles split. Claire held the flashlight steady, forcing herself to document every detail with her notebook and camera, even as her throat constricted. There were more drawings, a crude square with bars, maybe a cage, maybe a window, shapes of trees, and words, jagged and nearly illegible. "We wait." The silence in that chamber was unbearable, like the earth itself was holding its breath. They searched the floor. Among the debris was a fragment of cloth, thin as paper, frayed at the edges, faded green, the same shade as the scout uniforms. For the parents, it was confirmation. Proof that their children had been dragged here, had lived, at least for a while, in this suffocating darkness. But it also raised the unanswerable question: where did they go after this? One father stared at the scratched-out stick figure. His voice was a rasp. "One of them didn't make it out of here." Claire didn't answer. She couldn't. When they emerged from the tunnel, daylight felt hostile, too bright against their raw faces. They locked the sawmill behind them, but nothing could shut out what they had seen. Word spread quickly. By evening, the town was buzzing, half in fury, half in denial. Officials scrambled, promising to re-examine the site, but most people had already drawn their own conclusions. The children had been held there, hidden from search parties, concealed while their parents tore through the forest above. But the stick figures raised another question, more terrifying than the rest. If one was crossed out, then what had happened to the other 6? The news of the underground chamber spread faster than the officials could contain it. Within 48 hours, satellite trucks parked along the dirt road leading to the sawmill. Reporters tried to push microphones through the chain-link fence, but deputies kept them back with curt orders. "No comment," they repeated like a mantra, their faces stiff, their voices betraying strain. Behind closed doors, the parents gathered in one of their kitchens. Coffee steamed untouched in mugs. Nobody had slept. The drawings, the cloth, the shoe, they were no longer whispers or theories. They were real, proof that the boys had been alive long after the search was abandoned. And then, just as tension seemed ready to crush them, a new voice entered the story. A former federal agent, his hair silver now, his hands restless on the table, agreed to meet a journalist off the record. His words were clipped, chosen with care. "We knew," he said. "We knew it wasn't just a disappearance. But orders came down to stand aside. It wasn't safe. Not for us, not for the Bureau. The sawmill wasn't just a building. It was a conduit." The journalist pressed him. "A conduit for what?" The man didn't answer directly. His eyes drifted to the corner of the diner, watching shadows. Finally, he whispered, "You've seen the drawings." They weren't the only ones. He left before finishing his coffee. Days later, another witness surfaced, an aging truck driver with lungs ruined by decades of diesel. He trembled as he told his story to the local paper. "That night, the night they vanished, I was called to haul lumber. At least, that's what they said. I backed into the sawmill yard. They loaded me fast, too fast. I thought the weight felt wrong. On the highway, I kept hearing it, scratching, like something shifting inside the trailer. Then, a muffled cry. I swear on my grave, those were children's voices. I told my boss. Next day, he fired me." The man wiped his eyes with rough, calloused hands. "I didn't speak because I was scared. But I can't keep it anymore. They were in that truck." His statement ignited the town like kerosene. For every parent, it meant their children hadn't simply disappeared into thin air. They'd been taken, transported, hidden by human hands. And then came the newspaper exposé. A young reporter dug through property records and uncovered what nobody wanted to admit. The sawmill had been owned by a shell company linked to a Portland businessman. That man, in turn, had been investigated in the 1980s for suspected ties to an underground network trafficking minors across state lines. The case had gone nowhere back then. Insufficient evidence. Now, with the sawmill's drawings, with the shoe, with the trucker's testimony, the pattern looked less like coincidence and more like a map drawn in blood. Officials scrambled. Press conferences were called. But, instead of clarity, their statements only deepened suspicion. "We are reviewing new evidence," the sheriff said, eyes darting nervously. "But at this time, we cannot confirm any connection to organized crime." Parents stared at their televisions in disbelief. For them, the denials rang hollow. The next blow fell quietly. One of the mothers received a plain brown package in her mailbox, no return address. Inside, a child's handkerchief, yellowed with age, embroidered with the letters TJ, her son's initials. Alongside it, a folded scrap of lined paper, the handwriting shaky but legible. He lived until 1997. She collapsed in her driveway, clutching the cloth to her chest. Neighbors rushed to her side. For her, it was both salvation and torment. Her boy had survived. But for how long? And where was he now? The journalist who covered the story described the moment with quiet restraint. It wasn't hope. It was worse than that. It was proof that survival came with years of suffering. And yet, the package meant something undeniable. Someone out there still knew, still watched, still held pieces of the truth. By now, the families spoke of the investigation with two voices. One voice demanded justice, an end to years of silence. The other whispered of fear. If we push too hard, what else will they take from us? The atmosphere in town shifted. Some residents stopped talking to reporters, afraid of drawing attention. Others brought forward memories they had buried for 15 years, stories of unmarked vans on back roads, of men in dark suits visiting the mill long after it had supposedly closed. A retired teacher admitted she once overheard the former sheriff telling a deputy, "If you care about your job, don't look past the tree line." It explained too much, and not enough. Late one evening, Claire, the journalist, drove past the sawmill again. The police tape still fluttered, but no guard stood watch. She pulled over, notebook in hand, and sat in her car staring at the building's silhouette. Its broken roof cut a jagged shape against the stars. She could almost imagine the boys' voices still echoing underground, the chalk figures frozen on concrete walls. She wrote one line across her page. The truth was never lost. It was buried on purpose. But the most chilling detail came not from officials, not from records, but from whispers in a support group of parents. A father recounted how, a year after the boys vanished, he had woken to find a Polaroid slipped under his door. It showed a child, thin, pale, staring straight at the camera. The boy wore a scout's neckerchief. On the back, scrawled in pencil, 7 isn't a lucky number. He had hidden it out of shame, afraid of being dismissed as delusional. Now, hearing the others, he finally confessed. Every detail added weight. Every revelation pressed down harder. The boys hadn't been lost in the woods. They had been swallowed by something larger, colder, more calculated. And still, the question gnawed at everyone. Why? Why these children? In this town? At that time? The answer remained just out of reach. But the handkerchief marked TJ suggested something terrifying, that the timeline of suffering stretched years beyond what anyone had dared to imagine. The logging crew hadn't meant to stumble onto anything. They were clearing deadfall along a remote stretch of the Cascades when one of the men struck metal with his axe. At first, he thought it was just scrap, an old oil drum left to rust. But when the crew unearthed the object, dragging it from beneath moss and stone, they realized it was a chest, steel, dented, sealed shut with corroded latches. The sheriff's office took custody immediately. Reporters were told it was routine debris, but within hours, word leaked. The chest wasn't empty. Inside lay a small museum of horror, children's belongings neatly arranged, pressed into plastic bags that hadn't survived the years. A scout's kerchief, frayed at the edges. A pair of eyeglasses bent out of shape. A baseball cap, stained dark along the brim. Beneath it all, folded photographs, damp but legible. 7 boys stared from those pictures, laughing, alive, oblivious, and at the bottom, wrapped in cloth that had once been white. A human skull. Forensic tests confirmed the worst. It belonged to one of the missing scouts. The families were summoned to a secure room at the county building. They sat in silence as the coroner spoke, his voice cracking. The confirmation broke them in different ways. Some sobbed loudly, collapsing into each other's arms. Others stared into the middle distance, hollow, as if grief had calcified long ago. One mother whispered, "At least now I know." But across from her, another parent slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "No, you don't know! You know one. Where are the rest?" And that was the cruelest truth. The chest gave answers and questions in equal measure. The photographs inside added to the torment. On the reverse of one, written in a hand that was neither childish nor steady, were 4 words. "The rest are here." No location, no names, just that haunting promise or threat. Investigators swarmed again. The chest had been buried deliberately, its placement far from any trail, the soil packed tightly around it. Whoever had hidden it knew the terrain intimately. This was not the work of a stranger passing through. Journalists pieced together timelines: the sawmill, the tunnel, the trucker's confession, the secret orders. Now this chest. Each fragment reinforced the same pattern. The boys hadn't been lost to the wilderness, but contained, moved, catalogued. The weight of it crushed the town. Vigils reignited on the courthouse lawn. Candles flickered against autumn winds. Parents clutched the items returned to them, pressing cloth to their faces, as if scent might linger after 15 years. Still, not everyone accepted closure. One father insisted he recognized his son in a blurred photograph taken from the chest. "Look," he told anyone who would listen, his finger trembling against the image. "He's taller here, older. This wasn't taken in '92. This was years later." Experts examined the paper. The chemical composition suggested it was manufactured after 1995. If true, it meant at least some of the boys had lived well beyond the disappearance. The possibility fractured the families further. Some clung to hope with renewed desperation. Others felt the knife twist deeper. If the boys had lived, then someone had chosen not to save them. And then came the email. Sent to the newspaper's general inbox at 2:13 a.m. No subject line, no signature. Attached was a single photograph. It showed a group of children standing in a clearing, faces partly obscured by shadow. The resolution was grainy, almost deliberately degraded, but the outlines were unmistakable. Boys in scout uniforms, neckerchiefs hanging loose. 7 figures. The timestamp in the file's metadata read 2006. The newsroom froze. Reporters replayed the image over and over, zooming, adjusting brightness, arguing over every pixel. Was it authentic? A cruel hoax? Or the final proof that the nightmare stretched into the present? When the photo reached the families, reactions split again. Gasps, screams, trembling hands. One mother fainted. Another clutched the printout and whispered her son's name over and over as if calling him back. Officials dismissed it as a fake. "Digital manipulation," the sheriff said at a press briefing, his jaw set tight. "We have no evidence the photo is connected to the case." But off-record, even deputies admitted their unease. One confided to a journalist, "The background in that picture, it's not just any clearing. It looks like it was taken right near the mill." Which raised the darkest possibility of all, that some part of the operation continued, unseen, even after the world had moved on. The final broadcast of the documentary ended not with resolution, but with a mother's voice. She stood at the forest edge where the first search began, holding a candle against the dusk. Her words cracked, but carried. They keep telling us it's over. But listen, the woods aren't quiet. My son is still calling me. I hear him every night. The camera lingered on her face, then panned upward, through the trees, toward the darkening sky where the power lines cut a stark silhouette. The same lines that had carried whispers of children, cries buried under static, secrets buried under moss. And the narrator's closing line pressed into every listener's chest like a weight they couldn't shake. 15 years after 7 boys vanished, all we know for certain is this: the forest did not take them. People did. And until the rest are found, the story is not over.